Hello, I'm John Paul and I'm here at Rimmer Brothers today to do a head gasket on this 1998 MGF. We'll also show how to do cam belt in the same job. As you can see, we've already removed the engine cover and the soundproofing so you get again access to the engine. So now we're going to time it up and remove the timing belt. So we need to remove the top cover, then we'll go downstairs, turn the engine over so we can see all the marks. We'll show you them later, and then we're going to time it up and take the cam belt off. So remove the 5 8mm spanner size bolts out the top. There's one at the bottom, just 10mm spanner size. Just slacken it off because it goes into a little groove. It doesn't go into a hole. So once you've got those out, prise it away, pull it up, and then we'll go down below, take the lower cover off, the auxiliary belt, and then we'll time the engine up. We've taken the right hand rear wheel off. Now we're going to take off this cover now, so just 3 little screws, take them out, and then we'll remove that cover. Then we'll be able to see the end of the crank, so we'll be able to time the engine up. With the 3 retaining screws removed, we can now remove the cover, and then we can see where we need to be. I'm going to remove the auxiliary belt now, and then I'm going to undo the bottom pulley nut and remove the bottom pulley. Then we'll be able to see the cover, the lower cam belt cover. We'll take that off next. I'm going to use a 22mm socket on the end of the crankshaft pulley to turn the engine over in the direction of rotation, clockwise, and I'm going to look at the 2 camshaft pulleys until the marks line up. Now it does say inlet and exhaust on both pulleys, and what you need to do is on the exhaust side have the exhaust, where it says exhaust, pointing towards the inlet pulley, and on the inlet pulley it says inlet pointing towards the exhaust pulley. So inlet one side, exhaust the other. Okay, so we can see it says inlet on the inlet pulley, and that's pointing towards this little pointer here, and that little pointer there, and it says exhaust on the exhaust pulley. Now they're both in line, we can fit the camshaft pulley locking tool. Slides in there like that. If you haven't got one of these tools, it's not the end of the world. What I would advise is just mark with a little bit of Tipp-Ex on both pulleys and the timing cover, so that you can just see it more clearly, because it is difficult to see where them 2 marks are exactly in line. I've slackened off the alternator lower bolt, the bracket bolt, and the top alternator bolt, so we can then just pull the alternator forward so we can release the tension on the auxiliary belt and remove the auxiliary belt. Now the next job then is to remove the crankshaft pulley, and the correct way to do this will be to remove the starter motor and fit in a locking tool that locks onto the flywheel. We don't have that tool, so we are going to use a windy gun to take off the bottom pulley nut. Not the correct way, but it is the way most people would do it. Just before you undo that with a windy gun, I would just advise taking out the camshaft locking tool, because it will turn a little bit. So I would take that out, then we'll take that off with a windy gun, pull the pulley off, then we'll put the bolt back into the crank and retime everything up, and I'll show you that when I get there. And that's what we're going to do now. Using an 8mm socket, you just need to unadjust the auxiliary belt tensioner. So you just whiz it off, and that releases the pressure tension on the belt till you can remove it. Now I'm using my windy gun. I'm just going to remove the bottom pulley. Get that out of the way. Now what you will be able to see is 2 little pointers on the pulley there, and one little pointer actually on the timing cover, on the timing case itself. So what we'll need to do now is put the bolt back in using a 22mm socket, just round it back into line again, check the cams, fit the cam locking tool, and then we're going to remove the engine mount. Because we're going to be taking the head off this car as well, we've just supported the engine so we can take the engine mount off, just with a ratchet strap around the subframe and using a block of wood on the bottom of the sump. I mean, obviously it would be better off using a transmission jack, but because we want to let the ramp up and down quite a lot, we've done it this way. I mean, if you want to do it this way, you know, do it at your own risk, but you know, make it safe. It's a little bit difficult to show this engine mount being taken off from here, but there's 2 18mm spanner size bolts, 1 18mm spanner size nut, and then another one at the back of the engine mount here. That'll allow you to take the top half of the engine mount off, and then there's a larger cast aluminium part with 2 M8 bolts either side of it going into the subframe. If you take all them off and lift the whole engine mount out of the way, we'll be able to see the cam belt really clearly from that. And the 2 bolts out of each side of the engine mount, they go through the subframe, they do get very tight. You really need to make sure you lube the threads underneath and work them backwards and forwards, because you don't want to snap them off. They're awkward to get to, so just keep working them and they will eventually come out. Unclip the hydroelastic pipe off the engine mount. There's one other little bolt at the bottom of the engine mount you'll just have to take out once you're in this position, because you will need that out of the way, so you can split the top half and the bottom half of the engine mount. So hopefully with that out of the way, which is quite awkward, as you can see it's a little bit tight on the chassis, but with it out the way, we then hopefully should be able to get the engine mount out of the way. That bolt's a bit longer than I was anticipating, but that is out the way, and you can split the 2 parts, lower it out, remove that section, then remove the upper section of the engine mount. Then we can see the whole thing now, so we're going to take off the lower cover, retime the engine up, make sure it's dead on, and then we can take off the cam belt. Taking out the 3 retaining bolts from the lower timing belt cover, so we can just remove that. You can see the cam belt there, water pump there, which we're going to replace in a moment. We're going to reposition in a second so you can see up there, so we can slacken the tensioner off and remove the cam belt. Using a 10mm spanner, just going to slacken off the tensioner and get a 6mm Allen key, push it in the adjuster, turn it round to release the pressure on the cam belt, and then we can slide the cam belt. Before we change the water pump, we need to drain the coolant. Easy on this car, you've got a pipe underneath, so we can take the clip off, remove the hose, get ready for this. It's not a very pleasant job. The potential for getting very wet is definitely there. Okay, it's coming out nice and steady now. So once the coolant's drained, we'll go and take the water pump off. I've taken out the 4 M6 bolts around the outside, and they're all 10mm spanner size. There's one last one at the front, which is the 30mm spanner size, and it needs to get back in the same place because that's where the cam belt cover bolts onto afterwards. There's also one other bolt at the back that goes through the plastic cam belt cover into the back of the water pump. You'll have to make sure you take that out before you go any further. So take this last one out. We have previously drained the water out of this, so we don't make too much of a mess. So when you pull the water pump off, you definitely will get some water, so make sure you've got something to catch it in. And then pull the water pump forward, and there we are. We've got the new water pump and the new seal. I would always put some gasket goo around where the seal's going to go before you fit the seal. Put the seal in like that, a bit of a clean up, make sure there's none on the inside of the water pump, then we're ready to fit the water pump in. So make sure it's the right way around, fit it in place, and replace the bolts that we took out earlier. Tighten them up, don't forget to fit the one around the back. And that's it, we're ready to go to the next job. We're now going to take the rocker cover off, or the cam cover off. We're also going to remove the cam wheels and remove the plastic housing behind the cam wheels. So that's the next job we're going to do. So with an 8mm socket, we're going to take the rocker cover off and both the breather hoses. I'm just going to remove these 2 Phillips screws for the plug covers. Once that's out of the way, we can then remove the plug leads. Get them out of the way. Take off the 2 breather hoses, just little spring clips, use a pair of pliers, remove the clips, and we can just remove those 2 pipes. You might need a screwdriver to do this, I'll get one in a second to show you that. And then we're going to remove all these 8mm spanner size bolts around the outside of the cam cover, and then we can lift the cam cover top off. So just remove these 2 breather pipes. So you might need a little screwdriver just to prise them off, just to slacken it off a little bit. Remove them. All the bolts around the top of the cam cover are out, as well as the ones down the centre. So there's just one last one to take out. You might have to give the rocker cover a little bit of a tap, or just get a screwdriver just to prise it off. It'll get a bit tight. They can lift it off, get it out of the way, and we can see the cams. So now we're going to hold the cams and remove the cam wheels at the front. We've still got the camshaft locking tool in locking up the cams, so we can just replace that now. Then we can get our socket, 17mm socket, and undo both cam nuts. So there's number 1. Number 2. Let's get the centre bolts out, and then we'll pull the cams, pulleys off the cams. Then we can remove this plastic cover. With both the cam wheels removed, I mean, they're both fairly easy to get off. All you need to do is maybe get a screwdriver behind them and just lever them off, but they do come off fairly easily. And then there's we're going to take this plastic cover off now. There's several 8mm bolts, spanner size bolts. We'll nip underneath, undo those, and then we can remove this plastic cover. Just going to remove these 4 bolts from the engine mount, just to enable us to get this plastic cover off. Now they are Loctited in, so you can do them with a ratchet, but I prefer to do them with a windy gun. Just makes it a little bit easier on my old arms. So we're going to take them out and remove that. The engine mount out the way, we can remove the cover from the behind the cam wheels. Place that down. Now we're going to send the ramp up. We're going to take off the heat shields from around the exhaust, or the bolts down below anyway, and we're also going to take off the front pipe going up to the manifold. Then we can go upstairs and unbolt the manifold from the head. Do these 4 manifold bolts nuts now, the ones that bolt the exhaust front pipe up to the manifold. Now I'm going to choose to do these with a windy gun. These do get tight, they sometimes do snap off, so if you've got any heat available, you might, if they don't come off straight away, you might want to just heat them up. If not, there's always the option of taking the exhaust off a bit further down where it goes into the silencer, whichever's going to suit you really, but I'm going to take these 4 off now. With them 4 nuts off, we can pull the manifold down, just remove the gasket, put it to one side to safekeeping, and then there's a couple of heat shields, one on the this side of the engine, one on this side, with some little 8mm spanner size bolts. The ones that we can take off down here we're going to take off now, and then we'll go upstairs and take the other ones off up there. I'm now just going to remove the last couple of bolts from these 2 heat shields, get them out of the way. Then using a 15mm spanner or socket, we're going to remove all the studs from the manifold where it bolts to the head. Then we can get the exhaust manifold out of the way, and then we can move on. The manifold bolts removed, remove the gasket, and then can remove the manifold. Just remember to unplug the lambda sensor before you lift the manifold out. I'm just going to take this water housing off now. I mean, you can either take the hoses off and the wire, or I'm going to unbolt the whole housing. It's just an 8mm spanner, 2 bolts. If you just undo those, and then just remove it out of the way, and then we're going to move to this side of the engine. Going to remove this plastic ducting from the air filter to the throttle body, so undo this hose clip, and I'm just going to lift the boot up, go in from the other side to undo the other hose clip. Then we can pull that pipe off there, remove from the other end, and get it out of the way. We'll take off the distributor cap now, so just going to remove the king lead, let a 7mm socket, undo 2 bolts, and we can get the cap out of the way. And then we're going to remove the inlet manifold. To get the inlet manifold off, there is now just quite a lot of little bits and bobs to do. The servo pipe, there's a little red surround, so you push the surround in and pull the pipe out. It's just a little compression fit pipe. So get that pipe out of the way. Throttle cable, same again, pull it to one side, pull the cable underneath, right the way round, so we can get that out of the way. Same again, you just have to place these items so they're not going to be in your way when you start taking the cylinder head off. Here's a little fuel sensor pipe, so we're going to take that pipe off. There's another little compression pipe here for the fuel pressure regulator, we'll take that pipe off. A couple of little water hoses, so we're just going to get set to and take them off now. Right, so all the pipes are off the electrical connectors off the inlet manifold now. I've taken off the studs where it bolts to the head, so we're just going to remove the manifold and just sit it back out the way of the head, and it's okay there because now we can undo the head bolts and take the head off. Well, now I'm going to undo the head bolts. I mean, if you start right at the outside and go in an ever decreasing circle right to the centre, that's the best way to do it. So a little bit at a time on each one. And keep going all the way in, and then just keep repeating it until they're all nice and loose, and then we can remove the head. There are just 3 head bolts that are left that are obstructed by parts of the cam. Now, if you don't want to take the cam carrier off because the cams are shimmed up, if you don't want to take the cam carrier off, you can just get a pair of mole grips on the rough bit of the camshaft and just turn the cam so you can get the last 3 head bolts out. I mean, ordinarily, if this was some engines that are tied up on top dead centre, you couldn't do this because the valves hit the pistons. But these particular engines are timed up so the valves are the pistons are halfway down the bore, so there's no chance of the valves hitting the pistons. So if you just turn the cam, and then you can get these last 3 head bolts out. So all of the head bolts out, everything's out of the way. So now, lift the head off, put it on the bench, we'll inspect the head gasket, inspect the head. You can see now the head's off, you can see the pistons are halfway down the bore, which is why we could turn the cams and the valves wouldn't touch the pistons. It's also worth noting at this point, these are wet liners, so don't turn over the crank so the pistons won't go up and down, because if they do, there's a chance a liner will move up and it'll break the seal on the bottom of the liner. If it does that, it's quite a big job to repair it. With the cylinder head off the car, we can have a look at the head gasket. This is the old style head gasket that has got the rubber seals bonded to the metal head gasket, and this is the bit that used to fail. The rubber would come unbonded from the metal, let the water into the oil, and that's what gave these engines the problems. Now, if the engine or the car has been run overheated at any stage, then the head needs to be sent away, checked and skimmed. You can do it yourself if you want to. You can put a straight edge on and feel with feeler gauges, but you're best, if it has been overheated at any time, send it away, get it skimmed before you refit it. Now we're going to use the new style head gasket when we fit this one, which is a multi-layer metal type one, available from Rimmer Brothers. So before we fit this, we're going to just clean the head up, clean the block up. I'll show you that in a few seconds, and then we'll be ready to go. Just going to clean the head surface up with some fine emery cloth. Go all the way around the whole thing really. Just make it all nice and clean. Once you're done with some emery cloth, really nice. Get a little bit of Scotch-Brite. Just finish it off so it's nice and clean. Just inspect all the head, make sure there's no corrosion, and all around the cylinder top seals there. Just make sure there's no deep indentations. If there is, it would need skimming. But no, this one's looking pretty good. I think once we've cleaned that up, blow it off with an airline, and then we'll be ready to refit it. Like with the cylinder head, we need to make sure the top of the block is all nice and clean. All around the top of the cylinder liners, make sure it's all nice and clean. Just inspect it for corrosion, any damage. But yeah, that's all looking nice and clean. While we are here, we're just going to clean the top of the front pipe, so when we put the exhaust manifold back on, that's nice and clean. And we're also going to change the gasket that get onto the inlet manifold. So peel the gasket out, and then we'll just check the manifold and refit the new gasket. To fit the new O-ring gasket into the inlet manifold, little lugs on each end to make sure they point downwards. It only goes in one way, so it's not rocket science. You just feed it round, make sure it's all the way in nicely, and then we're ready to pop the head back on. We're going to fit the head gasket onto the block now, but there is 2 dowels, one at each end, and sometimes them dowels will stay in the head when you take the head off, so just if it does do that, take it out the head. They're only little plastic dowels, so just be careful, take them out, put them in the block so it's in the right place, and then we can fit the head gasket on. So this is the later multi-layer metal one. Now the head gasket does only fit on one way, so you know it is fairly self-explanatory. So we'll put the head gasket on now, make sure it's on them two dowels, and then we can get the head and fit it. Okay, we're going to lower the head into place. Just be careful. Get it to sit on the dowels nice and carefully. Then we can put the head bolts in and start to tighten them down. When you put the head bolts in, make sure they sit in nicely, and just make sure they're all finger tight started. So make sure that they all start the threads properly before you put the socket on them, just in case of cross threading. I'm going to tighten them all down to 20 Newton meters first, and then there'll be a following by 180 degrees and another 180 degrees. So first, let's get them all down to 20 Newton meters. If you follow the sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now I'm going to set up the dial gauge so we can do it as 180 Newton meters. But before we do this, just a precaution, if you mark every one of these head bolts with Tipp-Ex, so they're all pointing in the same direction, if you got distracted while you're doing the 180 degrees for any reason, you'd know which ones you've tightened and which ones you haven't, so you can keep a close check on that. We've set a dial gauge up on number 1 head bolts so far, so it's at the naught. We've got the pointer to stop it spinning, so then we can put our socket on and turn it by 180 degrees. If you haven't got a dial gauge, you can always mark the socket with Tipp-Ex and so you know where your 180 degrees is, but you are better off with a dial gauge. Then follow the correct sequence that we just did and do them all 180 degrees. Let's head back on. We've used a dial gauge, we've torqued down all the head bolts, done the 180 degrees twice. So now the head is back on. We're going to move on to put the inlet manifold back on, the exhaust manifold back on, and the odd little water jacket and bits and bobs. I've replaced the inlet manifold and the associated wires and throttle cable and such like things. I mean, if you're unsure, it's probably best to label all these things up, but to be fair, most of them, only one plug fits in one place, and the wiring loom, the way it goes, everything just is fairly self-explanatory once you start putting it back together. I'm now just going to put the water jacket back on the back of the engine, put the distributor cap back on, and then I'm going to put the exhaust manifold back on. Right, I'm going to fit the exhaust manifold now, so we'll pop the new gasket on into place, get the manifold, just watch the Lambda sensor wiring, pop it down there, onto the studs, pop the nuts on, and we'll tighten them all up, and we'll just go underneath, put the front pipe back on, and then we'll connect the Lambda sensor wiring. We've got the exhaust manifold on, just put the gasket on the flange for the front pipe, refit the front pipe, put your 4 nuts on, tighten them up, and then we'll move on to the next job. I'm now going to put the cam belt gear back together, so we're going to replace the plastic back cover, then we're going to put the cam gears on, we'll torque them down, and I'll show you about that when we do it. And we'll put the plastic behind cam cover on now. And just remember, there is one little bolt that goes into the back of the water pump. That's the most difficult one to get in, so I'd recommend you put that bolt in first before you replace the ones at the front, because it's just easy to get in like that. So once that's back in, we're going to replace the cam belt pulleys. Now, they're marked inlet and exhaust, so obviously the exhaust side wants to face exhaust side inwards and inlet side inwards. They're both marked clearly on the camshafts, so just make sure you get them the right way around. I'm going to torque up the 2 bolts through the cam wheels now. Now I would just replace the camshaft locking tool in between the 2 cams, so it locks them up, and you can get your torque wrench and you can tighten the 2 bolts down to 33 Newton meters. So once you've done both of them, we'll go underneath, we'll time it up properly, and then we'll get the cam belt on. We're going to replace the cam belt tensioner now. It's a little bit difficult to see up in the wheel arch, so we're going to show it here. This is the tensioner. Obviously it's one bolt. The wire catch goes around a bolt that's already sticking out the head, which is, you haven't taken out from earlier. And then once the cam belt's on, to tension it up, use a 6mm Allen key in there, and then you turn it. The spring pressure is captured by the bolt, and then that little lug there needs to end up in between the little wire, and that's the correct tension. Once that's in the correct place, you then tighten down the locating bolt. We're now going to fit the new cam belt. Same again, a little bit difficult to see here, but what you want to do is you want to put it around both the cameras, and then put it on the tension side down to the crank, and then round the water pump and round the tensioner. So the bit between the exhaust cam and the crankshaft, that wants to be the tension side, so that wants to be the bit that you fit first before the rest. Cam belt's now fitted and it's tensioned up properly. We've removed the camshaft locking tool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to turn the crank over twice, then recheck the timing marks, recheck the tensioner, and then we can put the covers back on. Now fitted the lower timing belt cover, replace the bolts. We're going to refit the crank pulley, torque it down to 205 Newton meters. Then we might as well put on the alternator belt while we're here, and then we're going to replace the engine mount. We're going to start to replace the engine mount now, so we'll bolt this bit to the side of the engine. Get that in place. Then we'll start rebuilding the other parts of the engine mount. There's the main frame that goes to the bolts of the subframe, and then there's the top mount. It's worth mentioning, just before we bolt the engine mount cross member in place fully, is just put the top timing cover in place, bolt it all up. It's just easier to get to it now than it is when the engine mount's all fully on. So we're just going to replace that, bang the bolts in, and then it also just mount all the engine mounting frame loosely with all the bolts, so everything's in before you tighten any of them up. I've replaced both the heat shields around the exhaust. Fairly simple, you just replace the bolts that you took them off with. Clip in the Lambda sensor wire into the little clip on the bell housing, and then plug the Lambda sensor into its plug. Now we're going to just replace the cam cover. So make sure this surface is nice and clean. You get your gasket, it's fairly self-explanatory. It says top and it says exhaust manifold with some arrows. So it's quite simple. So you just place the gasket there, and get your cam cover. Place it on top and then bolt it down. And we're going to pop the distributor cap back on, replace the plug leads, put your king lead back in. There's a couple of breather pipes into the top of the rocker box that we've got to just replace, and then it's ready to have some water in. Just start it up, bleed the system up, make sure it's all okay, replace the last couple of covers, and you're ready to drive away.